Welcome back to the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dylan Perrin, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Today, I'm speaking with Luke Nettheim from Beach's Scaly Beasts. Now, Luke is somebody I've been meaning to have on the podcast for literally years now. I think it's been 3 or 4 years. I often get requests from his fans and his listeners and viewers to have him on the show, and finally we're able to find a time. Both of our lives have got really busy in the past few years. We both have 2-year-old children, so that does take some time, as those who are parents know. But anyway, we finally had him on, and honestly, it was such a good conversation. We discuss Luke's journey from how he got into reptile keeping to how he eventually snowballed to keeping more than 170 animals, and how he dwindled that back down to a more manageable collection. And I think this is a really good episode for those who are maybe trying to figure out if they have too many animals, and if they do have too many animals, actually what process they should use to dwindle that collection down. We kind of talk about some of the steps you can use and some of the ways you can sort of be critical of your collection to see if it's something that you're actually managing at this time. Luke walks us through some of the current breeding projects he's working on, including some of the species that he feels that are totally underrated in our hobby. He talks about a brand new project that he hasn't even announced on his YouTube channel yet. Maybe by the time you've heard this, maybe he has, but it is a new project that's super exciting, and I can't wait for you guys to hear about that. And we wrap up the conversation with a discussion of Luke's background business, his enclosure background business. If you're somebody who likes aesthetic looking enclosures, then you will definitely want to hear the end of this podcast, because I love the way his enclosures look, and his business is a perfect way to get there. And obviously we also talk about his YouTube channel and the things that you can expect on there. Let's jump into this highly anticipated episode. Enjoy. Awesome. Well, Luke, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
No, thanks for having me, mate. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think this might be one of the longest episodes we've had kind of on the books, because I do get people reaching out all the time. There's at least one individual that's reached out a couple times, like, you have to have Luke on, and I keep feeling bad, because I'm like, it's in the plans. I absolutely want to have it on, but it's very difficult the time zones are difficult in Australia. Like, there's one point in time, which is now like the Saturday morning for you, the Friday night for me. It's the only time it works. So anyway, and then our lives have both got busy for similar reasons, the families and whatnot. And when I was looking through our DMs, I realized we first started talking about this in 2021. So somehow 3 years have gone by. It's crazy.
Yeah. Both become dads, got 2-year-olds, and yeah, everything's changed.
Yeah, time flies, COVID, all this stuff. So anyway, let's just start with a little bit of your background, who you are. Obviously, you live in Australia. You can kind of let us know maybe the area you live in, and how animals have been part of your life from, the beginning to now.
Yeah, cool. So I've pretty much always lived in Sydney or around Sydney in Australia. Right now, I'm kind of living on the northern fringe of Sydney per se. So yeah, not too far from the Central Coast, really. And I suppose animals have always been a part of my life, probably thanks to my mother. My mother grew up not really having any pets herself. So I think when she had us as kids, I've got 2 brothers as well, she kind of wanted to expose us to animals. And, growing up, we had a menagerie of things from, hermit crabs. I remember rats, dogs, cats, bunnies, guinea pigs, birds. We had a parrot out the backyard. Like, we had fish, you name it, we had animals. Mum had seahorses at one point. It was kind of like a pretty good exposure. Never reptiles or frogs or anything like that, though. But we ended up moving out of kind of like our big family home that we had, and we moved into our own family home that backed onto some bush in Sydney, backed onto a place called Red Hill in Beacon Hill, essentially. And our backyard, the fence line just kind of ran into some sandstone escarpment, and basically critters just kind of had free rein of coming out of the sandstone down into our yard. So I was constantly being exposed to things like, Sydney broad-tailed geckos or leaf-tailed geckos, different types of frogs and stuff around the area, blue tongues. I think at one point we might have seen a snake in the backyard. But yeah, and I think that kind of was my first introduction to reptiles per se, is kind of getting a bit of a general interest in them. I do remember at one point catching a few geckos and keeping them in Tupperware containers under the bed when you're 10 years old, that kind of similar story that most people have. But yeah, from there, I kind of, went through the usual stuff of growing up, being a teenager, start getting into beer and girls and all the rest of it. And then when I was kind of settling down with my wife, we lived in an apartment, and I remember this Asian house gecko, which is a pest gecko here. It had broken into our apartment, or turned up in our apartment, and I was like, oh, that thing's cool. So I caught it, stuck it in a little terrarium and stuff, and I had that for like a few months, and I was feeding it crickets and things. And anyway, it managed to escape somehow. And during that point, I was kind of like, oh man, I really enjoyed having that little gecko. So I just hopped on Google and looked up, geckos for sale. And then I realized that there was actually like a pretty big reptile hobby in Australia. And like you could just go online and talk to people and buy geckos. I never knew that anything about licensing or anything, because obviously we have that kind of system in place here in New South Wales. But so from there, I kind of went through the normal process of applying for a reptile license, and then uh, yeah, I suppose Pokemon collecting, as far as geckos started, I ended up talking to a few people and ended up with kind of like 20 geckos pretty quick. And, you know, you just get exposed to different things as you kind of get further down the rabbit hole. End up with a snake, or you end up with a bearded dragon. And yeah, I suppose things just kind of snowballed out of control from, yeah, probably my early 20s.
Wow. So it's actually not been that many years. I mean, are you're I guess in your early 30s now, or are you still in your 20s?
No, so I'm kind of in my mid 30s now.
Oh, you're in
So
your mid 30s. Okay.
yeah,
So it's
yeah.
been
So
like 15 years or?
probably more like 11 or 12, I'd say.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And I just, it's very difficult for somebody who isn't living in Australia to understand what it must be like to have that much wild reptile and like animals in your backyard, essentially. And how did that impact you? I mean, is it for you? Is it difficult to imagine living in a place where there aren't geckos and blue tongues running around? It's just very foreign to me.
Yeah, I suppose for me personally, like I'm not a big fan of cold climates, as I was kind of telling you off air.
Yeah.
I'm kind of complaining that it's 13 degrees Celsius here today, and I'm worried about putting socks on. Um, but for me, I'm a big fan of warmer climates. I personally probably wouldn't choose to live in Sydney uh, if it wasn't for family kind of commitments and things here. I'd probably be up the top end somewhere, in the Northern Territory or potentially Queensland or something like that, just in a bit more humid environment. But for two reasons: A, because reptiles are generally more abundant in those sorts of places. Also, I just don't like the cold. So that being said, though, I kind of think about certain areas in Australia where maybe there's less diversity of reptiles, but realistically, Australia is kind of like the home of the reptile, and it doesn't really matter what state you go to. There's places where there are plenty of, geckos, lizards, snakes, all the rest of it kind of cruising around, just obviously tolerant of different climates. So I can't really imagine, to be honest, living in a place without herpetofauna around.
Yeah. It must have just seriously impacted everything about the way you keep and the way you view things. So let's talk a little bit about your journey, because you kind of talked about the snowballing effect. So what did you got into geckos? Maybe you could just let us know kind of, was there a few species that grabbed your attention first, and how big did that collection end up kind of becoming?
Yeah, so when I first started, I kind of gravitated towards Sydney broadtail geckos just because they were a local species. Pardon me. And from there, I kind of discovered knobtail geckos. So that was kind of like a bit of a wormhole once I figured out that, there's a guy up the road an hour or a half away or whatever who had 100 of these things, and I could just go and pick them up at a will, sort of thing. So, yeah, thanks, Rick. He kind of probably snowballed me really hard with that. So from there, I probably amassed. It was a modest collection to start with. I'd say probably wouldn't have peaked any more than, like, let's say 30 or 40 geckos, and then I kind of had like a few loose ends next to it where I might have like a few, small pythons like Stimsons and Children's. I had a couple of bearded dragons, the kind of usual peripheral animals to maybe a project, if you wanted to call it that. But yeah, once I figured out how to breed knobtail geckos, that kind of got out of hand a little bit. I think I ended up with more geckos than, not that I could handle, but it was just, you almost were giving them away at one point because there was just so many of them there. And yeah, I think at the peak of my animal collection, if I want to call it that, I'd say it was about 170 odd animals. So modest by some people's standard, excessive to a lot of other people's standard. So I don't want to kind of get back to that number. I thought that was kind of getting a bit crazy.
Yeah. Is that in the same space you're in now?
No. So I've only been here for going on 3 years.
Okay.
Prior to this, I was in a space that was my in-laws' garage. So they basically had a double car garage and said, go nuts. And I did. And yeah, that's when I ended up with just everything from turtles, geckos, frogs, snakes, monitors. Yeah, it was like a little reptile zoo down there.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's such a common story for folks in our hobby, is that it's so easy to get to that point, and then you hit kind of that tipping point where you realize, okay, this is too much. And so that's one of the areas that I really wanted to talk to you about, because you did a great video, and basically the less is more concept, and you can expand on that in a second. And it's something that we've talked about on the podcast before, and I think for many of the listeners, it's becoming a more unobvious thing to do, to make sure that you don't let the collections grow. But I think with you, who's gone through that experience, we could probably give people some really good tools for analyzing yourself. Like, am I getting to that point? How do you know when you've got to that point? And then how do you actually get yourself, like, how do you back out of that situation ethically, which I think you probably did. So let's just discuss maybe your decision to sort of hit, like, was there a point where you're like, okay, this is way too much and I'm not enjoying this anymore? Or how did you navigate that?
To be honest, I think it was more so my hand was a little bit forced. So when I found out my wife was pregnant, and I've got a 3-bedroom apartment with 2 bedrooms stacked to the gills with reptiles, I was like, where am I going to put my son? Like, where am I going to put my kid? Like, my kid has to live here too. And there was a good point there where pretty much before he was born, I started moving on a lot of my larger reptiles. There were quite a few of my larger reptiles. So I had like a mangrove monitor, I had an olive python, I had some diamond pythons, carpet pythons, things like that were, considerably sized animals by any apartment standards, really. And I think I kind of reached the point where I was like, well, can I give these larger animals a bigger space to enjoy themselves in, rather than kind of putting like I don't agree personally with like a carpet python in a 4x2x2 box. I think it's just not quite there. Yeah. I was kind of keeping, albeit 3 diamond pythons, I was keeping them in a 4x4x2 box, which is probably still too small for the amount of animals that were in it. And I was kind of looking at a few of these things, and I was like, they're just too big, So they were kind of like the first group of animals, even though it was heartbreaking for me, because I did love some of those animals a lot, to move on, just because I was like, well, they're too big. I can't offer them what I want to be able to offer them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to focus on smaller animals, and then give those smaller animals the space. And then that way I could kind of juggle it a little bit, so I can still have a variety of animals and feel better about the space that they're in. So it's kind of like, making my conscience a little bit happier about a small lizard in a big box versus a snake in an adequate box. So yeah, that's kind of where it was. But yeah, it was kind of, I was already looking at a few of these things going, I don't know if this is right anymore. In particular, my mangrove monitor, although she was in a pretty decent size enclosure, I was always wanting to do more with her. But that particular junction in my life, I was like, I don't have the availability to do more with her now. So I made sure that she went on to somebody that was an aquarium builder by trade. And, he was planning this 10-foot long aquarium that was kind of 4 feet deep and 3 feet high, and like essentially a giant aquarium topper on top of that. And he's kind of sent me a few photos along the way and stuff like that of her like tearing into a full barramundi carcass and stuff like that. And I was like, well, these are all things that I couldn't do. Yeah. So that was kind of good to be able to make sure that a few of these animals went on to good homes. But yeah, that was probably one of the biggest decisions. And then kind of as my son came into the world and, my workload changed, my wife wasn't working, I had to pick up extra work. Then, the animals and my YouTube channel and stuff like that, I still consider that a little bit of an income, because it does kind of help pay for the own hobby. But in saying that, I had to make sure that I was able to juggle everything. And by having excess animals while I was getting used to becoming a dad and working extra hours and just being totally exhausted, I still kind of had to downsize it a little bit, just until I got that juggle sorted for myself and kind of my own mindset set into how I can run my day-to-day, looking after everything well. Yeah.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And fortunately, with something like a baby coming along, you're able to actually plan. Like, you basically have not quite a year, but say like 8 months to really renegotiate your space to make sure you're settled, where some people's lives can change overnight for whatever reason. And if you had those 170 animals in that situation, it becomes a lot more difficult to deal with. So I'm just, do you have any, like, if you were to look at your collection, do you have any things that you would think that would be an indicator that you're too big? You know, like, is there anything that you would feel when you're caring for these 170 animals, like maybe you're not enjoying it as much, or like any indicators that I mean, like you said, yours hand was sort of forced, but I'm just trying to think if somebody is at home and they're thinking like, how would I know if my collection's too big? Is there anything that falls in that category?
Yeah, for sure. So, like, whilst my hand was forced, there was still a lot of those kind of thoughts creeping in at this time. And anyway, so I kind of got to the point where I was looking at it more as a chore than enjoyment. You know, I was like, oh, I've got to go feed the snakes. Oh, I've got to go clean all the lizards. Oh, I've got to scrub all this glass. You know, it was like those kind of like moments where you're like, it becomes a job and not fun. You know, you're not kind of actually sitting down and enjoying your animals and watching behaviors and doing those things that you actually want to do. You're just kind of doing the bare minimum to get through. You know, you're just chucking handfuls of crickets at the animals and walking away and you know, leaving them to their day sort of thing. And it's when you kind of get to that point that I think you got to reassess and go, are you getting that day-to-day interaction with your animals that you want as a keeper? Because let's face it, we kind of all want like our own little private zoo that we can just enjoy, but you don't want that workload where you're getting burnt out and, you know, it's causing you a lot of anguish. So yeah, I think it's being able to kind of recognize those differences in how you're keeping your animals. And it's not necessarily that you'll be like lacking in care for the actual animal. You know, the animal will be getting what it needs, but if you're not enjoying it at the same time, then why are you doing it?
Yeah. Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
that's where you might go, hey, I just need to trim this a bit and just see what happens. Or, you know, maybe get rid of some of the bigger stuff that you don't necessarily enjoy so much and, you know, open it up to some space for something smaller to go into there. So it's a little bit less work, a little bit less poo, a little bit less food or electricity, you know, like there's so many factors involved.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that you'd mentioned in your video that was sort of the less is more kind of concept was lizard burnout. And I think that is, maybe I'll get you to expand on that. I mean, I think in some ways it hurts snakes because snakes are easier, so the care can actually be a lot worse because they can maybe be neglected a little bit more than a group of lizards. But I think some people probably don't realize how much more work lizards are compared to snakes, and how brutal that can be for you as a keeper.
Oh yeah, tenfold, I reckon. Like, I think that's why a lot of snake keepers can kind of have like 500-600 snakes and, you know, probably manage them. I won't say necessarily they'll manage them well, but at the same time, there's nobody doing that with lizards. Or if you are, you're crazy and you're doing it full time, and you know you are burnt out and you just don't want to tell anybody about it. But for lizard keepers, like, you know, a snake that might feed once a fortnight generally means it's pooing once a fortnight. You can change your water bowl a couple of times a week or whatever, and that's kind of like your maintenance regime. But, you know, I don't feed my lizards a lot, but I still kind of try to feed them 3-4 times a week. And with 3-4 times a week worth of food, that means there's 3 or 4 times a week that there's poo. You know, lizards are pretty good at walking through water bowls and, you know, running up glass and, you know, just dirtying the whole enclosure pretty quick. So, yeah, I just say like the metabolic rate of a lizard versus something like a python, obviously they're two completely different animals. So you've got to be able to manage those two completely different types of care. Like, I look at like my green tree pythons in their bioactive enclosures outside, and I'm like, this is easy. You know, like, you know, I could do 100 of these and not blink. But, you know, do I get that same sort of enjoyment out of that snake too? You know, they're not on the same level as an interactive pet as like a small dwarf monitor, for example, you know. So whilst I still find them interesting in their own right, they don't have that same sort of payout for the keeper, I don't think, you know, if you want that little bit of extra interaction. So, but yeah, as far as lizard burnout, if you've got a lot of lizards, like it's a lot of mess. Like, I had a friend, I'm not sure if you've had him on the podcast, but yeah, you probably should at some point. But Mitch Hodgson, he was probably one of the biggest gamid keepers in Australia for a number of years. And like, his setup was insane, but the amount of workload that he had for himself, like, I looked at it and I was like, he had probably the best gamid collection in Australia, like variety wise and everything. But I was like, this is going to burn hard and fast, because even me, as somebody that might have 20 lizards, looks at somebody like who's got 200 odd lizards and go, it's nuts. It's just nuts.
Yeah.
And sure enough, it kind of a couple of years roll around and he dipped his collection and just kind of found those little niches of what he wanted to keep. So him and I have kind of gone through almost that similar sort of pattern, but at the same time, just with different critters. So yeah, it's funny watching us all kind of go, oh, we're going through a downsize again. We just need to trim down the collection a little bit. And, hey, do you want this? It becomes kind of like a trading point sort of thing between the inner circle, should I call it?
Yeah.
But yeah, we all dip and fade through it.
Exactly. And so that was going to be my second question, or whatever question we're on about this, is like, what are some tips that you recommend for people for downsizing? I mean, the easiest thing is just throwing everything up online, but clearly most people want to, like you said, you have an attachment to these animals. You went out, you bought them, maybe you went to the expo, you had a few good years with them, and now you're kind of growing to the point where you think maybe this isn't the animal for me, but you still don't want the animal to end up in the wrong hands. So how do you ethically downsize where you can actually feel good about the fact that the animals are not being in worse hands?
So something for me is I tend to, like if I breed an animal, I'm more likely to sell that animal to general public, right? And you kind of do your due diligence and make sure they know what they're doing and talking about and all the rest of it, as per you would any animal. But the ones that I've kind of kept for those number of years, and I might have that little bit more sentimental value for, I tend to reach out to a lot of my friends and go, hey, I know you were interested in this. Do you want it now? You can scratch my back with something later, sort of thing. So it does become like a bit of a bartering system. So, I've got a few friends like that. And that's kind of handy to be able to do that because, we've all got an interest in reptiles and, you might want to just enjoy a reptile for a few years and then, pass it on to another competent keeper or something that it's going to be okay with. So it's kind of good networking out in the hobby and in the culture and stuff like that, and kind of having those friends nearby where you can kind of just spread the love between each other. Mitch and I are renowned for it. Man, the amount of trades we've done back and forth over years is, here's a boiga, here's some leaf-tailed geckos, here's a prickly forest skink, here's a this. It all happens. So that's probably my easier route. So whilst you might not necessarily be getting any money back for that animal right then and there, something's going to scratch you back later when you get the itch again and you need a new critter. So yeah.
I think it's so key. That's where the community does come in, and it's in many ways it's not really about recouping any sort of investment in that animal. It's about making sure the animal ends up in the right hands and that you can feel you can go to sleep at night knowing that you didn't just dump an animal off into some guy that's gonna like learn how to keep animals on the fly type thing. I think a lot of these are probably obvious to people, but for as far as the benefits that you have now downsizing, maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, if anyone goes onto your YouTube channel and sees your reptile room tour or even the enclosures behind you, you can see that the level of care is incredible. The enclosures all look amazing, and we'll talk about how you do that in a second. But what are some of the benefits that you've had now downsizing quite a bit? You basically gone down to like 25% of what you had at one point, or 30%.
Yeah. I suppose just time. Time's like the biggest thing, I can walk around here and I'll be stressing because it's like autopilot to stress about feeding all the animals. But that's like from me years ago. It's still just kind of embedded in me. Whereas now I'm like, oh, I've got to feed all the animals this morning. And it's like, oh, 20 minutes has passed and everybody's sweet, like it's like, oh, now I can go and enjoy my day with my kid and my wife or whatever and know that my animals are fed. Or, even just being able to if I have a day where my wife's not home or she's enjoying herself and the kid's in bed, and if I'm feeding the animals, I can just sit down in my chair here and just kind of like wheel around and just watch things hunt and actually get to see those behaviors, which is what I wanted to have when I first started becoming a reptile keeper. It's long gone are those days where it's like Noah's Ark, where I feel like I've got to kind of have a pair of everything. There's still things that I want and there's still things that I'm going to get. But at the same time, it's just realizing that limit and try not to surpass that limit. So, right now I'm a little bit, I won't say I'm flustered, but I've just got a few extra mouths because it's kind of like, the hatchie season's been, the market for reptiles is a bit tough this year just because of our economy and stuff like that. So I'm sitting on more animals than what I'd planned to be. But, you learn to roll with those sorts of punches. It's not too much more work. So, yeah, I think it's just being able to notice the difference and being able to, sit here and enjoy my lizards running around. That's a big difference for me.
Yeah, yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the room? Are you in a garage or are you in a separate bedroom? And tell us like what you can. I don't think we've talked about what's in your collection at this point. So please let us know.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so this room is what I kind of refer to as like my main reptile room. It tends to house basically more of my warm climate species. I think everything's lizards in here. I do have a little snake rack in the wardrobe next to me where I've just got some hatchling children's pythons that I'm raising up to wholesale. But basically, this room it's probably only like 3.5 meters by 3.5 meters. So I'm not quite sure what that works out to feet. But yeah, I've got a lot of gilleni in here at the moment. I think I'm surplus 20 gilleni in here at the moment. So Varanus gilleni. I have a pair of Kimberley rock monitors in here. I have a pair of black-headed monitors. I've got a shingleback skink. I have believe a pair of Agonia depressor or little pygmy spiny tail skinks. And I have a bearded dragon and a frillneck in that tank above me there. So that's this room. This particular room it's a bedroom, so it's attached to the unit. I don't have a big backyard or a shed or anything like a big shed anymore. I've got a little shed outside that I'm planning to do a project with soon. So maybe we could touch on that later. Then in my son's bedroom, he's got a pair of green tree pythons in with him, a pair of children's pythons currently, and a pair of rough scale pythons. The children's pythons and the rough scale pythons will be going though, because I'm trying to just get more real estate for his bedroom for him to grow up in. And that's been on the cards for a long time now. In the lounge room, I have a magnificent tree frog, green tree frog. I have 4 juvenile green tree pythons out there as well. They're kind of a few years old now. And I have a pair of Boyd's forest dragons, a big coral tank. I've got a big reef tank in the lounge room as well. And then outside, I've got a small lizard pit at the moment where I've got drawing a blank, Cunningham skink and a blotched blue tongue. At the moment, I've also got 3 water dragon hatchies that are in the bedroom. They were kind of a bit of a recent addition. They're a very unpopular lizard here in Australia, and I don't think that's right that they're unpopular. They're kind of like considered a bit of a cheap lizard, probably similar to like an iguana in, the US or something like that. So I kind of want to just grow them up and show people that you can still have an awesome lizard that only costs you $30. Like it's not necessarily about the price tag. They're an awesome lizard in their own right. So yeah, growing those guys up in the bedroom at the moment for a bit, just trying to get through winter. I think that's it animals wise, pretty much.
So you still have your work cut out for you for sure. It's still a good group.
Yeah. I think with the hatchlings I've got at the moment, I'm back up above 50 odd of animals. And I've got some eggs cooking in the incubator from the Kimberley rock monitors. So if that all goes to plan, there'll be about 10 of them hatching out soon.
Now, are the enclosures behind you, did you make those or are those purchased?
So both. So like these ones directly behind me, I built those out of PVC myself years ago now. Highly rate PVC as a product. It's it's not huge here in Australia yet, but I think it will become pretty big soon, especially with a few guys like Tyson from Habitats at Home and stuff making some really good quality PVC enclosures. The ones that are kind of over on this rack here, they're just Exoterras. Whereas these ones down here, there's some form ply enclosures that I made, as well as the one below that with the shingleback. And then this kind of like what I refer to as the monitor corner. They're kind of like a pre-flat pack vivarium that you can kind of just pick up from most pet shops from a brand called Reptile One. So I've done a few additions to just make them a bit more secure. They kind of come like, IKEA furniture. So they got those weird little lugs and stuff like that loosen up over time. So I kind of just went around and screwed them all tight with real screws.
Yeah, just that's the last thing you need is bolts coming out on monitor enclosures.
No, I get enough escapes as it is.
Yeah, I'm sure you do, especially with the little hatchlings and whatnot. Can you tell us a little bit how you go about designing enclosures as far as decor and everything? Because one thing I'm always jealous of for Australians is, and maybe some Australians wouldn't agree with this, you're sort of forced to keep your native species, obviously. But what that does is it allows you to have immediate access to the native decor. And that's something that I always regret about with my own collection of animals that I really do wish I kept more North American species, because then I could just go into my backyard and collect things like native trees and leaf litter and whatnot. Like I still use lots of leaf litter from here, but it's like oak tree leaf litter. It doesn't look like it's a rainforest, but I still use it. And so anyway, I think that's a big advantage for Australian keepers. You just go outside and you have these incredible branches and whatnot. So do you have a tactic that you use to set up things, or how do you go about designing and decoring the enclosure?
I suppose, I kind of start with the species that I'm, setting up the enclosure for. So I might kind of look at that species. I might flick through some websites. If I haven't been to their habitat before, I might flick through things like, Flickr, iNaturalist, all that sort of stuff to just kind of see a bit more of their habitat where possible. Some of those images aren't always possible to kind of get a habitat, essentially. It might just be like the actual animal in the frame, but you can kind of pick up some ideas about where these animals are coming from and the sort of rough textures and stuff that are on the rock, on the trees, that sort of stuff. So that, I kind of use that as a little bit of a baseline, and then from there, I just try to see what potentially I might have locally. So I'll use Billy the Frilly's enclosure behind me as an example. I was lucky enough to visit that habitat, but to find trees that were kind of similar to the background that I used in that habitat, I didn't have anything like that locally, but I had similar looking branches that had the similar sort of bark and texture that I wanted. They were just the wrong color. So I ended up getting some of those branches, and the bark was super loose. So I was like, well, how do I make this firmer so it's going to, withstand at least a few years worth of, a frill net climbing up and down them. And I covered the bark in PVA glue like multiple times to really like seal it in. And then from there, I essentially just used acrylic paints to match the trees in the background of his image from where, he naturally would be found. So, I think for myself, I'm pretty lucky that I tend to try to get out to some places and go herping and stuff like that. So I do get a pretty good visual eye on a lot of habitats. You might not necessarily see the animal, but you're in the location or something like that of that distribution range. Then you can kind of go, well, said animals found here. You got a pretty good idea about what their habits already are. That helps kind of design enclosures. Yes, we are very lucky that we can go out to the bush and collect bits and pieces. You're not really supposed to, per se, but at the same time, we all do it. Everybody does it. So, there's nobody really kind of banging on the door for a branch.
Where'd you get that stick? Yeah.
But that kind of helps being able to be just visually, onto whatever species you keep. And it doesn't really even matter if it's a bearded dragon. Bearded dragons are probably one of those animals that you see the worst enclosures out there as to what they actually live in. A lot of their habitat doesn't come with fluffy couches and hammocks and, lino tiles and all this sort of stuff. So, when you actually see these animals in the wild and you go, oh, it's 3 meters up in the air, it's 6 meters up in the air in a tree,
Yeah.
That plays on your mind a bit too, I find, where you kind of go, when you do see these animals in the wild, you're like, I'm not giving them enough. I remember seeing my first gilleni in the wild, and we put it back in a tree and it climbed like 8 meters high in a tree. And you're like, nobody's got an 8 meter high enclosure, but the lizard's using it.
Yeah.
How do I feel about keeping that lizard in that 3 foot high box, that 4 foot high box?
Yeah.
Not great.
I'd like to take a quick break to thank today's show sponsor, Damascus Limited. Many of you are probably already familiar with Damascus, as the founder has been on the podcast before. That's Thomas Griffiths. Last summer, we did a podcast called The Fundamentals of Lighting, and if you are any way confused by lighting, you must go listen to that episode because we break it down in very simplistic terms. Damascus is an independent animal and husbandry consultant, as well as a research and development consultant. Thomas works behind the scenes to help improve lighting technology for everything from just a keeper like you and I, all the way up to really high-level zoos. Thomas has an incredible amount of experience from testing lighting technology all the way to actually making sure it's implemented properly in the field, which makes him uniquely positioned to give lighting advice for animals in captivity. He works with all taxa, ranging from small reptiles and amphibians all the way up to large mammals. He is trusted by zoos, vets, and the world's leading manufacturers. This allows him to offer professional and friendly advice tailored specifically to your needs, knowledge, and budget. Damascus also covers continued professional development and training for those of you who work in a pet store, a vet clinic, or a zoo environment, and all advice given is protected by insurance. Thomas is available for both in-person and virtual consultations. If you are looking for more information on Damascus, make sure you head to Damascus.com. That is TOMASKAS.com. That's what I always say. There's, you can look at your enclosure in your room, and maybe it's a 6 foot or an 8 foot tall, long enclosure, 3 or 4 feet high, and it looks huge because it's taking up a giant portion of the room. But if you took that box and brought it into the rainforest, it would look like a tiny little thing. It's just a small section of the rainforest that would hold a very little piece of the rainforest in itself. So I think we kind of, in some ways, trick ourselves into thinking that we're offering a lot of space when in reality a lot of times we aren't, and that definitely is one thing that as an Australian you would be confronted with all the time, right? I'm not going to come across a boa outside anytime soon unless there's some sort of weird escapee, but you're going to see those animals that you're keeping outside doing the wild thing, and yeah, I could imagine that would actually make it harder to come home to them.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that, once I'd been out a little bit too, probably contributed to my decision to get rid of the larger animals in my collection when I was going through those downsizes. It was just that kind of like, well, it makes me feel worse seeing these big animals in an adequate box, whereas I'm happy to have 3 little gilleni in a 4 foot high box because at least they do have usable space. They still can run around. They can still exercise to a healthy manner. Is it the wild? No. Are we ever going to be able to replicate that? Maybe one day if you're really dedicated. Like if I was smart enough, and I've said it for years, I kind of like, if everything went to heck, I'd be happy to try to do a really big project where I put like a pear or a tree or a gilleni in this whole room and turn it into a big habitat for them, But, is it always feasible? Am I going to get bored with that easily? You'll start having all these other questions kind of creeping in with that too.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about, you had mentioned that you have a potential plan for a shed outside?
Yeah, so I have this habit where I get really bored every winter when all the reptiles are essentially sleeping, where I decide to do silly things and get into other hobbies. And last winter, I essentially put a pretty tiny shed in my courtyard. And with that, I decided to fill it full of discus fish and decided I'd breed discus for that season, which kept me entertained for winter. And then, once I kind of bred a few hundred of those and moved them on, I was like, oh, okay, I've done that. That was cool. Checked a box for me. And now essentially recently in the last kind of 6 months, I just turned that into a bit of a bug shed to breed crickets and wood roaches and stuff like that.
Is that shed I've seen on your channel where it's like you have that like foil kind of insulation on the inside? It looks like a little space shuttle or something.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's not necessarily the best looking thing, but that's the little shed that I've got at the moment.
So in there right now is all your like mostly feeder insects and whatnot? I guess it's kind of nice.
Yeah. It's good to have a space for them to be. But things have kind of changed in my mind about what's happening there. And I suppose depending on where this comes out, people might hear it here first. But essentially, I used to be into Australian frogs like a few years ago, like pretty hard into them. Now, Australian frogs aren't worth any money. There's no money in frog breeding. It's more like it's not always about that anyway. But it's for me, it was kind of like one of those things that I was keeping them for the passion and the enjoyment of having these frogs and just being like, wow, like these are so cool, and just appreciating the animals. But I kind of got a little bit stumped because in Australia, the frog hobby is in its very infant stage. It's very low down the pole when you verse it to reptiles. And, reptiles are still a pretty new hobby here too. So with that comes lack of access to a lot of species. Again, we can only keep Australian frogs. But yeah, for me, I kind of capped out at like 8 species and I wasn't able to find any more. And whilst I still loved those 8 species and I kind of just had small groups of them, I was kind of like, oh, I'd love to have this because we've still got heaps of different frogs here. And recently within talking to a few frog people, a few frog breeders and stuff, I've discovered that there's probably closer to 30 species in the hobby now.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, oh, no, this is dangerous.
Yeah, you're like, why am I asking these questions?
Yeah, and my friend and I, we run a podcast as well called the Australian Herpetoculture Podcast, and we interviewed this lady called Michaela from Max Frog Army. just only the other night. And she's going, yeah, I've got 18 species. This is all the stuff that I got available. And then she's like, oh, I'm really getting into monitor lizards. And I was like, oh, are you just? I was like, well, if you're up for a trade for a gilleni for a few frogs or something like that, we might be able to organize something. So yeah, long story short, I think that's turning into like a little frog room out there for probably about 8 terrariums or so out there. Because, I watch a lot of the dart frog guys in the States and stuff like Troy, and I enjoy all those kind of guys builds, and I love my frog tank that I got in the lounge room, which is heavily inspired from guys like that. And I think, yeah, it's about time that I just put some time and effort into my little winter project of building up a bit of a frog wall for a few of these species that I've never been able to keep before. So yeah, that's on the cards now. So I think I'll probably have about 15 frogs coming next week.
Oh wow, so this is happening right away.
Yeah. Some trades have been made. So.
Yeah, well, that'll be cool. I mean, I'm definitely, I don't have any frogs, but just like you see them pop up. You see Troy stuff. You see anybody else in that space, and you think, there's no way that I'll get through all of this hobby and not end up with frogs at some point, because it's very different from keeping reptiles, and the people that aren't even in the reptile space will find beauty in them as well, because they are so cool. And I'm not super familiar with the Australian frogs as far as like what are some of the species that might be coming your way.
So we have loads and loads of tree frogs in particular, and that's where my interest kind of lies predominantly as far as frogs are concerned. So we do have a lot of like kind of smaller species and things as well, which were probably more similar size to dart frogs. But for me, I've got Perrin's tree frogs, dainty tree frogs, whistling tree frogs, a white-lipped tree frog, and I feel like I'm missing a species there. But yeah, there's a few species on the way. But I did a run with like really tiny frogs, and a lot of our really tiny frogs here in Australia, like the Latoria phalanx or the little eastern dwarf tree frogs, they're super bouncy. Like they're like the size of essentially a dart frog, but they can jump like 2 meters. So, when you open up a cage, it's kind of like roulette with those guys. So I'm kind of going like what I consider like a medium frog, which is kind of, between that kind of 3.5 to 6 centimeter range. So when they bounce, it's a little easier to find them, and that they also don't quite have that same hop. So, they've still got a good launch, but I'll be able to find them easier. So, and plus they kind of just make it a little bit easier for prey size. You don't have to deal with like a lot of tiny bugs and kind of sift bugs and things, which I found very time consuming when I was dealing with a lot of really tiny frogs. So it's also about, again, easing into that sort of thing where it is easy for me that most of my stuff here eats a medium to a large cricket, or I've got babies that are eating small crickets anyway. So I've got access to all the food that would still feed the same sort of animals, or the same size sort of animals. So yeah.
Are the males, are they fairly vocal, those in some of those species? I'm sure the whistling tree frog sounds like it probably is.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been, funnily enough, I've been playing lots of frog noises. We've got this app down here called Frog ID, where essentially you can kind of do some citizen science, and as you're walking around the bush, you can take recording of frogs, and some guys from the Australian Museum will kind of like identify the frog species and upload the recordings and things. And I was playing a few of these calls to my wife, so she knows what she's in for, and to my son. And my son's like frothing on it at the moment. He's loving all the frog calls and that. And I'm like, see, he loves it. It's good. Yeah. It's good. Kind of getting that nudge of appreciation from him. So yeah, some of them do have quite a loud call. The white-lipped tree frog in particular, they sound like a dog barking inside. So for me, part of this deal is Mac's been so kind to, say that if it turns out to be a male, we'll swap for a female. So then at least we can avoid the dog barking part. A couple of the frog species do have a little bit of a loud call, but it's not going to break people's ears. I think one of the things that kind of works to my advantage currently, and I might eat my words on all this, but one of the things that works to my advantage is I live very close to a railway line. So we all have double glazed windows, and with the frogs going to go into a shed outside, everyone's got their windows shut up of nighttime essentially. So, even if there's a few frog calls here and there, it's not going to be the end of the world versus a freight train.
Yeah. Your neighbors shouldn't come storming over right away anyway.
Not right away. Yeah. So we'll deal with that. as it comes.
And do you think you'll tackle breeding at all, or is this just pure enjoyment?
Look, like I'd love to breed a species and just have the fun of raising tadpoles and stuff like that. There's no doubt. Like I'd get a mad kick out of that. Um, but for me, it's more about the enjoyment than anything.
Hmm.
You know what it also is, and like this is going to sound really funny. You know how there's like a lot of YouTubers that'll go out and they'll get like a fresh animal and it'll become like kind of like the new thing for like the next month or so. They're kind of promoting it as like a cool new animal they've got in their collection, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Something that I think about a lot is I'm in a position in Australia where my channel's very small versus, like a lot of guys in the US and stuff. But my position in Australia is reasonably strong in the Australian hobby where I can kind of draw in an audience to see an animal and appreciate it. And that's kind of what I want to do with those water dragons, because a water dragon's a pretty accessible pet for people to buy here. It's not $1,000 lizard over here. It's a $30 lizard. So
Yeah, it's so weird because here it's like nobody has them.
yeah, exactly. Like I've seen some expos and stuff from, over North America, and you see the price tags. I'm like, you kidding? I've seen 20 today running around the yard, like it's just stupid to me, but it's not to you guys. But yeah, I'm in a position, and this goes for the frogs as well. Hence why I was going into this conversation is not a lot of people keep frogs in Australia. And I kind of want to be in a position where not only am I getting my own enjoyment out of it, I'm going to be going nuts on backgrounds and doing all sorts of stuff with these vivariums and that, and getting my own kick because I'm a very creative person. But at the same time, it's also a position to be able to promote species that we have here in Australia. And as the frog hobby grows, it'll be good for people to be able to see correct care, good enclosure setups, things like this, because a lot of the frog guys are quiet and, they might not want to put that sort of content out there, which is fine. But it's just a way for me to, get my kicks, but also be able to promote something that's not really like a big part of the hobby.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, like something that's I understand why people gravitate towards eventually breeding an animal, because you sort of master the husbandry, and breeding is an aspect of their behavior and a whole other adventure to go down with that particular species. But then, like you said, if it's not an animal that draws any interest, there's an ethical conundrum of like, do you breed an animal that you're not going to be able to sell, not to make the money, but just the fact that you have however many baby froglets that now you have to deal with, and you maybe you can't care for them, and eventually that snowballs into something that's unmanageable. So you in some ways it's nice to be able to create an environment where people are going to be interested in buying them, and they're able to watch how to care for them, so they have the foundation, and then you can go and sink your teeth into actually learning how to breed them and getting through that learning phase. So in many ways, it kills two birds with one stone, because you're creating a market for something, and not to create a market to make money, but to create a market to actually work with the species. So you're not dealing with excess offspring for not being able to offshoot them anywhere.
So perfect example for me was the Gillen's monitors. I started getting really into them and breeding a few of them. I ended up keeping a bunch back and kind of creating my own little project army, whatever you want to call it. It was kind of like my little thing that I really got a kick out of. And when I finally got to the point of releasing them, the market here had changed a lot since I started keeping them myself. When I first started keeping them, I was buying a couple of animals for like $200, $250. By the time that I'd made dozens of videos on Gillen's monitors showing how cool they were and all this sort of stuff, kind of promoting them as a really cool little dwarf monitor, they turned into a $600 plus lizard. And all of a sudden I was seeing them at expos for $750. And I was like, this is insane. Did I cash in on it last year? Yeah, I did, because at the same time, I put a lot of work into making those videos and things like that. And I think a lot of people might have, I don't know, and I don't want to sound like I'm being cocky or arrogant or anything, but I think potentially a lot of people might have got a lot of sales because of me potentially driving the popularity up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there was a little bit of a roll-on effect there. I don't know, but that's just a little bit of a theory. So, what was once the humble old Gillen's monitor that's, been on average a $200 lizard, it drove up the market. And for me, I'm not going to, because the market's dropping on them now, I'm not going to be out of them. They're still going to be here. They're like my favorite lizard. So they're always going to be here regardless of the price tag on them. And I've always loved Australian frogs. And I think having access to these frogs and being able to kind of like ethically show them in a good manner. And, if I do breed a good spawn, a lot of our frogs here have like hundreds of eggs in a go. There is no way I'm raising 100 frogs. Like I'd probably like, you know, keep a little batch of like 10 to 20 tadpoles or something like that and see if I could do it with that. And then just discard the rest, put them in the freezer or whatever before they start doing anything, Like people will probably think that's crazy, but at the same time, I don't want to be cramming animals into spaces for the sake of 30 to $50 a frog. Like that's just silly to me.
Yeah.
I'd rather have the fun and show tadpole success with 10 tadpoles or something like that. That just seems more ethical to me to do that. And then making sure that you have the right homes for those to roll into, because if you don't have the homes, then why did you do it?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it is very funny. Just discussing even the difference between the water dragons here and there, and how people become interested in an animal because it's valuable, which is it's so goofy because it's the exact same species as it is. Like the Australian water dragon is the same here as it is there. There, it's a species that nobody wants to keep. Here, it's like a very coveted species. And we're all the same type of people. We all like reptiles. So the only difference is the fact that it's rarer, which I can understand that, but that's a hard speed bump to get over in our hobby, is that people will gravitate towards things that just happen to be more expensive and miss out on some of these incredible animals that are like a green anole, for example, is a really cool animal that you could have this amazing active terrarium for that has lots of life in it, and people will shy away from them because you can buy them for $8 or whatever.
yeah,
It's kind of an odd thing.
yeah. I tried to say it to an analogy. I said an analogy to somebody the other day where I was like, a Ferrari and a Corolla are both cars that will drive you from A to B.
Mm-hmm.
If you can see the appreciation in being able to go from A to B, what's the difference with a lizard? So recently we actually had a water dragon move into my in-laws' place. I've got a pool. His name's Reggie, and he's become very accustomed. Even though he's a wild lizard, he's now getting hand-fed mealworms. He's getting strawberries. He's getting fed, like he's essentially become like a dog in the backyard. And with that, I was also working in a job site where it was just riddled with water dragons. And I was really just like spending some of my lunch breaks and that sitting down, just watching them and just enjoying them. And I was like, man, nobody has these things in Australia. Or they have, there's a few people that keep a few here and there, but like they're one of the prettiest lizards in Australia. They're probably one of the biggest gamids in Australia. So they're a big lizard.
Which how big do they get? They look quite large.
Yeah, like a big stonking male, including a tail, will probably be like 80 centimeters. Like they're a pretty good sized lizard. But that being said, like the crests on them, the patterns on them, the males when they get that beautiful red chest, like all these sorts of things come into play to just show how pretty they are. They're a very cool lizard, but yeah, nobody really seems to appreciate them here, which I just think's crazy. And I'm the same. We used to go out herping, and we kind of had this thing where with the group of friends that I was with, if we saw a water dragon, you used to not tell people because you're like, oh, it's another water dragon. It's almost like an embarrassment to say, oh, I found a water dragon.
Yeah,
and then they'd be like, oh, you're losing 10 points on your herp score sort of thing. Like it became like a running joke. Whereas now I've done a complete 180 and I'm going, no, you know what? The small things, the little lizards, the crazy things that you see here, I appreciate it all now, like right down to little brown garden skinks, which I just walk over half the time. I see them like tussling around fighting in my courtyard, and I'm like, they're so cool, man. They're so cool, but nobody keeps them,
Yeah, there's just a weird perspective that people will have, and you take on this perspective of the other hobbyists as well, right? Because people don't really like them, so then you're not going to like them either. What's the just listening to the story about Reggie moving into the yard there? I'm just curious. Are reptiles, just from a non-reptile person perspective in Australia, are they seen as like more like a pest? Like if you had a reptile get into your house, like I think of like if you had a raccoon get into your house or a rat get into your house, that's a pretty disturbing experience for people. They're actually really creeped out, and there's like disease that they think is going to happen, and that is that the same sort of sentiment with reptiles?
I suppose it depends who you are. Here in Australia, obviously, we have lots and lots of snake catchers. Like that's an actual profession you could go down the path of because there tends to be a fair whack of snakes turning up in people's places. Lizards, not so much of a problem. Most people kind of give lizards the blind eye and no, it's just the blue tongue in the backyard. It's not such an issue. But people obviously still have that same sort of culture where, snakes aren't welcome.
Mhm.
So, over here, even in Sydney, we get things like red bellies, brown snakes, depending where you are, you can get copperheads and tigers and all sorts of venomous animals. So, you know, a lot of people that aren't reptile people obviously have those sorts of concerns with those sorts of things coming in. You can get a lot of diamond pythons around where we are too. So quite often diamond pythons like living in your roof because it's nice and warm over winter and they can kind of come and go and they might get a possum that decides to move into your roof or something like that. So, yeah, I suppose it just depends on who you are. Like my wife's grandparents, when before they moved into their retirement home, they had a big diamond python that lived in their roof for years. And he was just like part of the furniture, to the point where I remember this story of Edwin. He was eating his breakfast and this mysterious liquid dropped through the roof, through the
Oh.
V grooves into his cereal bowl. And yeah, it turned out the diamond python just went to the bathroom above him. So, like that's how close they were. It was like, oh, well, I suppose I'm not eating breakfast today. It's just kind of normal that this diamond python lived there. But you'll get plenty of people that don't want that too.
Yeah.
So, you know, I
It's
just
just
like
a
hearing the stories of people that do want them. It's more
Yeah,
exciting.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, that's cool. You haven't ever gone into the world of venomous at all, have you? Keeping venomous?
No, the craziest venomous thing that I ever kept, which is very, very, very low down the totem pole, is Boiga irregularis, so the brown tree snakes. They're a rear fang colubrid.
Mm.
Um, for me, I was kind of getting into them a little bit just before my son turned up. For myself, with like the more highly venomous stuff, I just don't trust myself. I just think that I'll be that person that might screw up or get lazy or complacent or something with something, and yeah, I don't need the hospital trip. I don't need all that drama in my life. That's
Yeah.
not for me. I can appreciate the heck out of them. It's the same as like when we go out herping. Like I'm not going to pick them up. I have no need for it. To me, that's just a risk. And it's not that I don't love the animal or anything. It's just I'm just minimizing my risk to me getting hurt. Sometimes when you're out in the middle of absolutely nowhere, like you could be 12 hours from hospital. Like, I don't need the plane to come pick me up and hopefully I'll live. Like, to
Yeah,
me, that's just a
exactly.
risk I don't need. So, and I'm not having a crack at anybody that does keep them, that does go out there herping. I have complete respect for people that are able to do that and they want to do that. Uh, I've been herping with the likes of like Ricky Mack and Luke Yongans and stuff that'll quite happily be holding a mulga snake with no shoes on
Yeah.
type thing. So,
Yeah, Ricky
you
is
know,
like the archetype of an Australian. When you see him out there, it's like, oh, that's just a guy with no shoes on, like grabbing a snake by the tail with a mullet.
yeah, I will say that Ricky is a complete freak, absolute freak of nature. In his own words, he told me when we were herping with him up in the NT, he's like, I'm not good at much in life, but I'm good at this. So they
Might
were
as
his
well
own
go all
words.
in.
Oh, like we were driving like 100 kilometers an hour in his Land Cruiser, and he would ID a snake that I couldn't even see like half a kilometer down the road. Like he'd be like, oh, that's a black-headed python up ahead. And you'd be going, what? What are you talking about? I can barely see a stick. And sure enough, he'd pull up right next to it and go, there it is.
That's
He's a freak.
crazy.
He's a freak. Absolute freak.
Is that all he does? Like, I guess he has a YouTube channel. That's what he does. He just gets out there, films, and it works for him.
Yeah, look, I think he does some part-time work through I don't know if it's necessarily fauna spotting or fauna relocation through the mines. I know he's done a little bit of that over the recent years. So, the mines over here, I don't know what he was getting paid, but generally they pay pretty good. So if that kind of just keeps him afloat, I think. But yeah, he's a good soul. He seems like a bit of a drifter. He just kind of goes where he pleases, sort of thing. But yeah, he's got a pretty free lifestyle. I'll give him that.
Yeah, no, if it works for you.
More power to him.
Yeah. Can you? I want to talk a little bit more about. I want to get into the YouTube channel as well as the bush to the box because I think that's a fascinating part as well. But can we talk a little bit about the gilleni? Because you had mentioned that you can species that you fall in love with. I feel like they're not that popular here. Maybe nobody really keeps them. I don't know how many people keep that species just because how rare Australian species are. But I think when I had Cooper on years ago, he has a couple as well. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. But I remember him saying that he loved them as well. So can you just give us a rundown of that monitor species?
Yeah, for sure. So Coop actually got one off me years
Oh,
and
he
years
did.
ago. So
Okay.
yeah, he's got the one currently that I'm aware of. Um, yeah, so Varanus gilleni, pygmy mulga monitor, they're an awesome little species that only grow to about or 25 to 30 centimeters. Some get a little bit bigger if they happen to be just genetically made that way, that come from the arid interior of Australia. So they come from good mulga country. Mulga is a type of plant here in Australia, or a tree. They're associated with this tree because it tends to dry out very well, create a lot of like loose bark and hollows and cracks where the monitors obviously use that as a refuge, in between coming out and basking and hunting themselves. So as far as over here, or in New South Wales, they're considered a class 1 species of monitor to keep. So that means that you can go out and get your basic bearded dragon license, or, your basic license, and you can still keep this little tiny goanna. So for me and my rundown with them is I really fell in love with them. I kept about 4 or 5 different Adatria species early on: Ackies, black-headed monitors, freckled monitors, and the gilleni. And I was really drawn to the gilleni because they were tiny compared to the other ones. They're kind of half the size on average of the other monitors. They were not shy. So they'd be very bold, sitting out in the open, basking in front of you, begging for food, all this sort of stuff. And for me, that just kind of drew me in. They also kind of they have a few habits where they do things that are kind of silly that will almost make you question everything. Like I've seen them like hanging from one toe on the roof asleep, or, they'll be hanging from both back legs, just kind of like looking like they fried themselves on a light bulb or something like that, but they'll just be asleep. I've seen them just do weird things. They're just weird little monitors that are just full of character. So when you compare those to things like, I love my black-headed monitors too. Super reclusive, super shy. For me, that's almost like herping in my room. If I get to see them, I'm like, oh, wow, I got to see them today. Whereas I can come in here and be like, gillens, 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 gillens. They're all out doing stuff. They're all active. So yeah, they're an awesome little species, obviously a little tree-dwelling species. So yeah, I don't know what it is that makes me love them. I think it's just because they're small, they're handy. They can fit into most people's lives because they are a tiny animal, and they're full of character and just full of life.
Yeah, and you get that monitor experience in a much smaller package that's manageable for most.
It's hilarious. So locally, we've got lots of lace monitors around us, and I see them very frequently through the job that I do. And lace monitors, you see them strutting around. They got that big monitor swagger. They get throat puffing, all this sort of stuff. And then you come home and you see a 30-centimeter gilleni doing the same thing in the cage, and you're like, what a joke. This is hilarious. You got that big man strutting a small package, but it's awesome. It is awesome.
That is awesome. Yeah, that's super cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about sort of your media side. You have your YouTube channel, as well as maybe we'll start with the business, the backgrounds. Can you tell us about what that is and how you started it?
Yeah, for sure. So basically, when we were on that same herp trip that I was with Ricky, I was with Luke and Tyson as well. And we were actually in gilleni habitat in a specific spot. And we just found the lizard. And I was looking around and I was like, how can I bring this home with me? Like I'm soaking up the habitat. I'm trying to soak up as much information as I can, but I don't have a way to like bring this habitat home. I'm sure you could probably take a couple of logs or something if you wanted to drive 3 days to go and pick them up and then 3 days home. But that's just not in everybody's cards. And at the time I was actually getting ready to refit this kind of corner with all these monitor enclosures, and I'd started to kind of work on the gilleni habitats, where essentially I just painted the back walls blue, like it was like kind of like a bit of a sky scene, and I'd made some clouds and all this sort of stuff. And I was like, that just looks like garbage compared to looking at the image of the habitat. So I simply just started taking photos of the habitat, and I was like, this is awesome. And then we were sitting in the car. We had a big drive to go after that, so I was kind of just spitballing with Tyson and Luke, and I was like, it'd be great to get these images printed up into a large scale to put them inside of the terrariums or the vivariums and be able to use that. Tyson's always got great arguments for me. He's a very thinking man. He's a big believer in lots of like backgrounds, like 3D backgrounds and stuff like that, as far as like usable space goes. And I completely agree with him for most species. But for the gilleni, that essentially living in these little tiny thin tree hollows, they don't exactly have like a big rock escarpment behind them that they're going and climbing up. So I kind of wanted to replicate what they were in nature, where they're kind of potentially just using a few trees that they kind of go between. So yeah, I started up contacting a few different businesses and seeing if I could print my own backgrounds and stuff for my reptile room. And after I did the gillens, I was like, I need one for the Kimbo. I had that image too after being on a herp trip. Kind of printed that off, made a bunch of mock rock back rocks and stuff like that to go alongside it because obviously they're a rock monitor. Okay, we'll do the Tristis too, you know. And before I knew it, I'd kind of filled the room with all these images that I'd taken, and all these people started contacting me, going, "Where'd you get those backgrounds? Where'd you get those backgrounds?" And I was like, "Well, as far as like a business goes, it's not a hard business to necessarily do because if I've got the images." You know, I've got friends in the herp community that go out and take images and stuff like that. So why don't I look at potentially setting up a small business, you know, just like a little auxiliary business to my usual daily sort of stuff, getting these backgrounds printed and kind of just working with people alongside the species that they have and what sort of image that they have. And we can post them to them and then they can use them to put them in their enclosure. So to kind of describe the product itself, essentially it's a really high quality vinyl that's like a low tack vinyl. And essentially it's a giant sticker that go into your background, into your enclosure, and you can kind of cut it to size as far as your enclosure goes. And they're very easy to kind of work with. And for me, this is something that, you know, there's other businesses out there that are printing directly onto enclosures and things like that, which is fantastic. I think some of those look awesome, but if somebody decides that they're going to change the species that's in that enclosure or an animal dies and they're going to put something in there, they're stuck with that image in that background. So for me, having something that you could take in or out and post in a poster tube around the world versus a whole flat pack enclosure or something like that, that was just another option. And, you know, it's not necessarily for everybody. And I agree, you know, that's okay too. But there's a lot of people that get use out of this. So for me personally, like if we kind of bring it right back to trying to talk about like time management in a collection, if you actually look inside of my enclosures, the decor and stuff's pretty simple so that I can kind of work around all of that. But the enclosures themselves look more appealing and visually appealing because they do have these printed backgrounds in there. It kind of gives more for the eye, more for the lizard's eye. Like, I'm not sure if there's many studies out there that have been done on, you know, if a lizard's just in a black box or a white box or a glass box, like, what are they getting out of that visually? At least here they've kind of got a range of colors that are a bit more natural, you know, to kind of look at. I don't know how they see them necessarily, but it might just be that it's, you know, a little bit more closer to their habitats. But yeah, that's what it kind of started.
Sure. I mean, there's obviously color. You know, that's one thing. Lots of green and blue, and we know that they can see color. So I'm sure that has some effect on them.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, it's fantastic now too. I've kind of gotten to a point where I've sent some to Belgium, I've sent some to Canada, I've sent them to the USA, I've sent them kind of all over the world. You know, there's a lot of people out there that are keeping Australian species in particular that don't have access to their sort of background images per se. So
is the back, it has an adhesive on it, or how does it stick?
Yep.
Oh, it does.
Yeah,
okay.
Yep. So if you imagine like, you know how people wrap cars in vinyl?
Yes.
Or they do vinyl signage on a building. Yeah, it's the same sort of thing. But just the quality that we're using and the durability of it means that, you know, if a frill neck decides to jump against it and slide down with his nails, he's not tearing it up. You know, he's not doing any of that. And it's protected from UV with some of the laminate that goes over it. It's made to be there for years on the side of a building in sunlight. So
right.
If it can handle that, it can handle a reptile enclosure.
Yeah, well, I think in my opinion, I think it does look really stunning. I mean, when you walk through your room, they look like windows rather than enclosures, which I think is what draws your eye to them. And I know people. I was just having a conversation with a listener not that long ago, and she was like, "I don't like those because they don't seem very functional." And she was a lot more like utilitarian with her enclosures. Like, I like to have shelves and everything, which I totally understand as well. But I think there are ways that you can implement a 3D element into those backgrounds to make them 100%. Usable, right?
Yeah, 100%. Like Tyson just did an awesome enclosure where he essentially built a 3D background into the back of it, but then the two side panels are kind of like forest images. So he put it in for a green tree snake. So the green tree snake's now got the full use of the background as he loves. And then he's also got that visual of, you know, both the side panels now look like a forest that he's in. It's the same as like my Kimberley rock monitor tank. That's full of mock rock, like stacked to the gills with mock rock, but it's got that image around the back of it. So they're still using every bit of rock that's in there, just as they would in the wild, but then they've also got that image around there. So it depends on the type of keeper you are, but at the same time, there's no reason you can't merge them,
Yeah,
But,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it looks great. And like you said, there's some species that aren't going to be using a 3D background anyway, or maybe the decor in front is enough for that they don't need that. But it adds such an interesting element, which is funny because when you think back into like the 90s of aquarium, fish keeping, they would always send you like your fish tank would come with these horrid backgrounds that never looked good. It would always like so corny. And I feel like there's been a lag in the reptile world because of that. Like you think, no, don't put an image on the back. It's just going to look stupid. But it doesn't. It looks, I think it matters on the quality of the image and making sure that the perspective is right. But for some reason, it looks so much better than anything that you would have seen back with the fish tanks. It's crazy.
Yeah, 100%. One thing that I've definitely noticed is a lot of venomous people seem to love them. So when I'm talking to clients and stuff, they'll be like, oh, this is for a palehead snake. This is for this species of brown snake or something like that. Because obviously a lot of venomous keepers probably keep a reasonably simple enclosure so they could work around the actual species. But then by having the option to put something in there, that plain box just goes from being plain into something that looks half decent. Even if it's for the kept and the keeper, it's just that little bit more aesthetically pleasing, but still completely functional for being able to be safe around those venomous animals, So, yeah, as I say, like it's not necessarily for everybody. A lot of skink keepers, like a lot of blue tongues, I've done like a lot of blue tongue enclosures now because, they don't tend to climb as much as a lot of other species and things. They're a bit more ground dwelling. So, yeah, as I say, it's not necessarily for everybody, but at the same time, you can make it work with whatever you want to do, You can still put big branches in front of it. You can still put rocks in front of it. You can merge the rock into the background. I've seen it all done. It's cool to see it all being done too. And just seeing that kind of marriage in between mock rock walls and something that's aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah. It's your eye responds well to it anyway. And so if somebody is just, they want to do that, is there like certain sizes they come in, or do they give a custom size? I'm sure lots of people, the back wall is going to be pretty universal for many people.
You'd think so, right? So for me, I noticed I did like kind of like a big order when I first started up the business where I ordered like 20 of the most generic sizes. I thought, 2-foot enclosure with all 3 walls wrapped, 3-foot, 4-foot, just kind of like your standard off the shelf kind of enclosures. And I sat on those backgrounds for so long because everybody was contacting me going, oh, I want this image, but this size. I want this image in this size. And, what have you got in that would work for whatever species. And so that's where I kind of learned. I was like, you know what? It's more of like kind of like a custom go-to thing where I just have to work with the person and figure out what they want, and we'll get them exactly what they want. So like, for example, I had a stock image sitting in the shelf over there that was sort of okay for a brevicorder. But the client was kind of like, no, I just really want like good sand dunes with spinifex. Sweet, I got that as an image. So he didn't buy the one off the shelf, but now he's bought one for a gilleni and one for a brevicorder now, just to kind of make it worth his while as far as postage and everything goes. And he placed that order last night, and that'll get underway this week. So it's just talking to people about what they're keeping, what they want to expect out of it. And I'm kind of getting to the point now too where I've got a few herpers that are kind of coming on board. So when they're out herping, if I can't get out and take images all the time, they're kind of getting on board where they might kind of get like a little bit of a kickback for using some of those images that they get while they're out there too.
Yeah, I was going to ask. I think that's a great business model. You have so many amazing Australian herpers that you see all the time that are often very good photographers as well. So you might as well, and that's going to be the easiest photo they take all day is just taking a picture of the landscape.
100%. Yeah. I'm not a good photographer by any means. I'm definitely learning a bit recently about different styles and kind of just making things better quality. But at the same time, some of these guys with great cameras, great gear, great know-how, like they can take a good habitat shot.
Yeah, I have a photo from Matt Somerville just right here that he sent me because he's an amazing photographer, but he doesn't sell anything. I told him you should sell things because people would buy them. But so I asked him for a picture of a carpet python, and yeah, it's awesome. So it's I think it's an awesome idea. I think the enclosures look really cool, and there's so much you can do with that. The people should definitely go check that out. And we'll make sure that at the end we'll give everybody the info for that. Let's talk a little bit about the YouTube channel as we wrap up here. You've been doing YouTube for when I look at your channel, it's been around for 6 or 7 years, but I imagine that's not been pretty consistent. At some point, you decided that I want to do this like somewhat consistently, or what's the story there?
Yeah, to be honest, I think Cooper was the one that kind of kicked me into gear for that. So, yeah, there was a few kind of early videos of just random things, lizards eating different things and wild lace monitors and such. But Cooper came around, and obviously Cooper has a reasonable channel, pretty decent channel here in Australia. I think he's at 21,000 subs or something like that. So he's about double myself or so. And yeah, he came around and filmed a whole bunch of my animals, and I watched that video back and kind of saw uh, that he was getting quite a bit of traction for that. And I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. People seem to be interested in these sorts of things. So I was like, maybe I'll just start filming like a little bit of the day to day, goings on here, a bit of maintenance, a bit of this, or putting a pond filter in, whatever it might be. And yeah, one thing just kind of led to another, and it just sort of sudden became kind of like its own little thing. So, I kind of grounded out for like the first 1,000 or 2 subs, and from there, kind of, it's just been steadily kind of ticking up ever since. And I'm not one of those people that I'm kind of like, you'll get a video every Sunday. Like I can't kind of commit myself to that because I do have a little guy in my life now that takes precedence over all that sort of stuff. So just when I've got the energy or when I've got some stuff to film, I try to bank up a few videos and drip them out. At the moment, I think I've got probably one a week coming out for the next 5 or 6 weeks, which is pretty good for me. But yeah, it definitely has turned into its own little thing where, it's its own community. Like I get all these people asking how I'm going, asking about animals and kind of checking in on me and seeing how things are going. And yeah, I don't know. I've been enjoying the ride so far. I really hope to grow it, to be honest. Like I'd love for it to turn into like over in the US, you get those guys that are kind of almost doing it full time, and in Canada and stuff, like guys like Dion from Reptiliatus and that, like, kudos to him. That's pretty cool to be able to do that as your job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even if I could get to the stage where I could be kind of like, part time with that, as far as an Australian goes, I'd be stoked.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, you definitely build a really interesting community of people who really care about what you're up to and the animals that you have. And those are the folks that would reach out to me all the time and say, hey, make sure you have Luke on because, he has a great channel. And I think people often have soft spots for smaller channels like ours, that aren't the big, millions and millions of subs out there, but they know the content is good and they just want their names to get out there. So I think you do end up meeting these really cool people. And I actually stumbled across I think it was a reel that you had posted on your Instagram where you talked about potentially shutting down the bush to box business, which was the background business, but the post that I found was basically saying, actually, no, we're not going to shut it down. We're going to kind of continue going. I know this is kind of doubling back, but this kind of relates to the community aspect. I imagine that you had a lot of those community people, the community that you've established, reached out to you and say, hey, no, we're here to support, or maybe you could tell us that story briefly.
Yeah, so basically, like, long story short, I've got about 5 different incomes that I'm juggling, including from bush to box. So juggling all that, being a dad, being a husband, looking after all the critters and stuff, it can become pretty overbearing. And I definitely had a bit of a moment of weakness where I was kind of like, you know what, this is kind of like it's ticking along, but it's not going to buy me any houses or anything like that. Not necessarily like that's what I had the plan for, but at the same time, it's got to earn its place to be able to be a viable thing to do. And I had several people reach out to me that maybe just gave me like a good pep talk as far as like, saying that I'm onto a pretty good thing, and it's a good kind of like fun. It is a fun auxiliary thing to have happen, but I went through working with a few people that were a bit tough to work with during that sort of business side of things, and that just kind of made my life pretty difficult. So yeah, I definitely had a good handful of people, including patrons, including, people that just know me through YouTube, some actual friends and stuff like that reached out and just checked in on me and made sure I was okay and stuff. And yeah, just gave me a bit of a pep talk to kind of go, you're doing good, man. Like, don't give it up. You're doing something good for the community here. So yeah, that definitely helps, just kind of turn the lights back on and kick me into gear a bit and kind of reset my thinking, I think.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of finding the people, building a community online, to have people surround you. It's pretty awesome. And as far as the YouTube channel goes, where did the name come from?
So I started up Beaches Scaly Beasts because I used to live in a place called the Northern Beaches. Okay. And basically, I never thought that it would go anywhere, like my Facebook page and stuff. I never thought it would go any further than the Northern Beaches. So Beaches Scaly Beasts was kind of like it's Scaly Beasts in the beaches, like this is what you're going to get when you come pick up a snake or whatever it might be. So uh, now I look at it nowadays and I'm like, I don't know if I should change it or if it's just stuck like that, but I just think I got to roll with it because that's what it is. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was never meant to get to what it was. I was never meant to be like a face of the community or anything like that. I never expected to be kind of in the public eye per se. So yeah, it is what it is, but it's just rolled on from there.
Oh yeah, I think you should definitely keep it. I mean, it's very unique, so it's easy to remember, and I think people will absolutely associate it with you. But I wondered, I'm like, where does Beaches come from? Because I was like, maybe it's like part of his name in some way, or But yeah, okay, that makes more sense. And maybe you had already mentioned this, but also you do record a podcast with Mitch, the Australian Herpeticulture podcast. Is that you guys do that regularly, right?
So that's with Jason Rogers. So Mitch is a good mate.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So Mitch has been
I was
on
thinking
a few
Mitch
times.
because I recorded. I was on a thing with Mitch where I think it was for the Australian Herp Society. Maybe that's what it was. That's where Mitch was in my mind.
Yep.
He had recorded something with me like probably like 2 or 3 years ago now. So anyway, I'll let you continue on with the podcast.
Yeah, Mitch is a great bloke. I'd consider him probably one of my closest friends in the herp community. But yeah, no, I do it with Jason Rogers. So Jason Rogers, he's got a Instagram page called The Gecko Effect. He's mad into geckos and stuff. He's been instrumental in probably pushing me in a few different directions too, as far as like just bioactive keeping in a few species and stuff like that, which is always good fun. But yeah, we run a podcast called the Australian Herpeticulture Podcast via Morelia Python Radio. So obviously with Eric and Owen over there. And yeah, we've taken a bit of a hiatus as I got used to kind of being a dad and he started up a new business and such. So we kind of both got pretty snowed under for a year or so there. But now we're really trying to kick it back off again where we might just do it kind of like a fortnightly thing. But yeah, I think we've got like close to maybe 100 podcasts or something out there or in that sort of vicinity where we've got heaps of people from Australia, obviously. We've got people from authors, zookeepers, people from the museum, people from, herping backgrounds, keeping backgrounds, photography, all sorts of stuff to do with Australian reptile hobbying, really. Just doesn't matter what kind of aspect of it. We all love everything of it. So yeah, just trying to promote the Australian hobby a little bit, I think, and as far as a podcast form goes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to give. I think the United States is what's the word? Domineering is the wrong word, but it is very domineering. Everything is so United States centric, and not saying that's a bad thing. It's just in our space, that's where the biggest creators are, and that's where most people gravitate towards. So it's nice to get different perspectives from slightly smaller herpeticulture communities, because there's just so much value there. And I've listened to a few episodes of the podcast. It's been a while because by the time I deal with my podcast, I honestly don't even feel like listening to reptile stuff anymore by the time you get out of this room. And but I know that it is a very good quality podcast, and people will want to go check it out. Luke, this was awesome. I'm so glad we were able to finally do this. It's been like we said, 3 years to finally find a day that works is awesome. Is there anything that we didn't say today that you wanted to wrap up with? No pressure either way. I just wanted to make sure that we covered everything.
No, look, I think we've had a pretty good yarn, to be honest, mate. It's been a pleasure being here finally, and yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad. Yeah, this was fantastic. Please let everybody know the YouTube channel, the Bush to Box, where they can find that, and the podcast as well, and Instagram and anything else.
All right, so a bit of a list there, but basically as far as Beaches Scaly Beasts on any social media, that's what you're going to look up. So that's on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, all the main kind of places. As far as the podcast goes, it is on Spotify, Instagram, Transistor, most places under the Australian Herpeticulture Podcast, or you could always look up www.moreliapythonradio.com, and we should find links and stuff on their main sort of page there. And as far as the background side of things go, you can contact me either on Facebook or Instagram as far as From Bush to Box goes. But I also have a website you can contact me through, which is just www.frombushtobox.com.
Awesome. Well, Luke, this was an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for finally being a guest on the podcast, and we will definitely do another one again in the future. So thank you very much.
No worries, Dylan. Thanks for having me.
All right, that is the end of that episode. Luke, thank you so much for jumping on the podcast. I'm so happy we finally were able to find a time that worked. I always do love talking to Australians, but the time zone difference can make it very challenging. So I'm so happy we were able to finally do that. Listeners, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you share it on social media, Instagram, Facebook, however you want to do that. That really does go a long way to help expand the listenership of the show. You can also feel free to make a comment on Spotify or YouTube. And by the way, for those who watch on YouTube, I want you to know that you can also watch on Spotify as well for free. It's you don't have to be a Spotify member. You can listen to podcasts on Spotify for free. You don't have to have the subscription or whatever, and you will see the video version as well. So a little hint, if you watch on Spotify, you don't have to see the YouTube ads. I know I do put the YouTube ads in, maybe 4 or 5 per episode, and I make a small amount of money on it. But if you don't want to see those YouTube ads, you can see it on Spotify for free. Maybe I shouldn't even be saying that, but it's just a pro tip for you. And if you would like to support the sponsor of the podcast, make sure you head to customreptilehabitats.com. You can find an affiliate link in both the YouTube description or the show notes. Or you can check out patreon.com/animalsathome and become a patron, which is, I'm so grateful for every patron that is on the Animals at Home patron, because that really does go right to editing the podcast. Without you guys, the podcast would not be edited, which means there would be no podcast. So anyway, that is it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching or listening, and I will catch you in the next one.